Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and welcome to week 18 of my 2019 reads. This week was a pretty good reading week. I finished off 3 more poetry collections, and I also read a sort of contemporary fantasy type novel as well as a little novelette. First, I'll talk about the poetry that I finished this past week. I did talk about these 3 collections of poems in my wrap-up for April, which was National Poetry Month. I will link that below, but I will talk here just a little bit more about my thoughts and my ratings of these poetry collections. So the first of which was For Everyone by Jason Reynolds, and this I listened to on audio, which I really enjoyed. I thought he had an amazing reading voice, and it was very perfect because this wasn't a poetry collection. Instead, it was one long poem that was, in a sense, a letter that Jason Reynolds wrote to himself in his young 20s, or really to other artists, other poets, other writers, other creators. And the focus of this poem is, how do you handle having dreams, having big dreams, and not achieving them? So in his early 20s, Reynolds was not very successful as a writer. He is now, but he wasn't then. And there was a lot of self-doubt and a lot of issues of, am I doing the right thing? Just lots of insecurities and lots of frustration. And so this poem I thought was really beautiful because it spoke to that desire to create, as well as that fear of it not being enough. And the poetry in this was so beautiful. I really like his way with words. I love his use of sort of playing out with words. Sometimes the metaphors really reached out to me. I thoroughly enjoyed this poem, and I thought that it was both the poetry and the message that were so powerful in this, that motivation to keep creating for the sake of creation, and to not let those insecurities get to you. It was very beautiful. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Long Way Down, which was also by Jason Reynolds, and this was also amazing. It is a contemporary story told in verse. So it's basically a story in poetry, very much like the poet X. So this story follows a teenage boy, I believe he's 15, whose older brother has just been murdered in front of him, in sort of a gang violence type of situation. And it follows him over the course of that day, handling the grief, handling the anger, handling the fear of dealing with his brother's death, and also this feeling of a need for revenge, a need for retribution, a need to do what is right for his brother's memory. And it is a bit of a magical realism type of story. There are ghosts involved. I thought that this was really truly wonderful. Not only was, again, the poetry absolutely lovely, I love the rhythm, I love the words, I love the imagery, just some of it was very, very, gave me shivers. So not only was the writing itself just beautiful, but you really got sucked into this character's perspective. You understood how he felt, and you understood what choices he was battling with. Reynolds also makes this a very political type of statement because it looks at what are the issues that kids in communities with a lot of gang violence face, and what choices do they have, and how are cycles of violence perpetuated. So this book was good on so many different levels. The language was beautiful, the characters were so well developed, there was so much emotion, there were so many social and political themes explored. It was just absolutely wonderful, and I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars as well. Next, I finished Finding My Elegy by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this is a poetry collection that I heard about from Rachel at Kalanadi, who I will link below. And this poetry collection as a mixture of some of Le Guin's older poems as well as some of her newer poems from the latter part of her life. And it was really lovely. It focused a lot on nature and on sort of self-reflection. Especially the earlier poems, there was a lot on nature, and in the later poems, there was a lot on aging and on coming to terms with, you know, the fact that you will probably die. There was also just this sense of peace that permeated so many of the poems. It kind of alternated between more modern styles of poetry with freer verse and slightly more classical types with more structured verse. There were poems that rhymed and there were poems that weren't. It was very interesting. You know, the whole point of this collection, Finding My Elegy, is in a sense a retrospective on her life and a reflection, and it felt like that. It very much felt like a reflection on her life and explored a lot of the scope of her poetry and her thoughts. I, in general, really liked these poems, but there were a number of poems that didn't quite work for me. There were quite a few that were very, you know, speaking out against things that she didn't like, especially things like the kind of trashing of nature and, you know, bad choices that humanity makes. There was like a poem about the absence felt of a tree that was cut down because, you know, people didn't see the value in it. And so there was some anger in those poems, which I connected to a little bit less. I think I connected more to the poems that were appreciating nature and finding peace. Those are the ones that really spoke to me. So overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I finished Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, and this is a novel that I had heard about from Njeri at ONYX Pages, who I will link below, who really loved it. It's also a book that is up for a bunch of different awards and is very interesting because I think it shakes things up a lot. So the premise of this story is very interesting. It is, in a sense, very much a memoir, but it has overlays of magical realism and fantasy. And I don't think that I can fully tell where the fictionalization stops and the real memoir begins. I have a feeling a lot of it is actually just very true to Emezi's life. And Emezi's life is very interesting. They are non-binary, transgender, and they are embodied by multiple spirits or personalities. And so the character in the book is similarly embodied by very different gods, Nigerian gods, leading to sort of a multiple personality type of situation. The character in the book goes through a lot of different issues, a lot of trauma, and struggles with a lot of different issues of depression, issues of self-harm, lots of self-harm and eating disorders, and sort of using sex as a way to escape things as well, has experienced sexual trauma as well. I mean, this character is dealing with a lot. And the story basically just follows the character from birth through adulthood, coming to terms with these multiple god personalities that inhabit her. And it is very interesting for that, very interesting for the look at lots of different kind of an own voices type of representations of somebody who is Nigerian American, somebody who is non-binary, transsexual, somebody who is also just multiple personalities. So there's a lot of really cool aspects to it. However, overall, I wasn't such a big fan of this book, and it's super hard for me to pin down why. Some of the things in this book are very similar to other books that I've read this year and given 5 stars to. So, for example, a lot of the mental health issues and the dealing with trauma and the kind of making bad life choices, those are very similar to things like Giselle in An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon, which I just read recently and loved. Also Hunger by Roxane Gay. So in a sense, I felt like I should have really liked this book, but there were just issues that I had with it that I didn't even realize I had until I kept reading. I think up through the halfway point, I was actually pretty much enjoying this book, and then as it moved further, I just felt myself getting more and more distant from the characters, getting more and more distant from interest in the book, and towards the end, it was kind of hard to get myself to pick it up. I think if this had happened earlier in the book, I might have DNF'd it, but it happened so late in the book, like 90%, that I just went ahead and finished it. I think that probably the issues that I had the most problems with were, it was a very dark book, and I always struggle with things that are dark. I think that for me, the darkness has to have a purpose. It has to have meaning, and it has to be justified, which is not necessarily how life is. It's not necessarily how things just should be. But for me, it's very hard to read a book that is dark without that purpose or light. And this book just felt very full of darkness for me. There was just so much cruelty, both towards the main character and from her towards other people, and sort of unapologetic cruelty. It's not cruelty because, you can't help yourself, but it's cruelty because the gods that live in the character's mind just are cruel. That's the nature of the gods. And there's zero apology for that. And there's so much drama and emotional abuse that happens between the characters. It felt a little bit like a cesspool of emotions. It was just so negative. So that, and then just all of the self-harm and the abuse of other people, both physical and emotional and sexual, it was just hard for me to read this. So I think that was that darkness without the purpose or the light was very hard for me. I think the other thing that maybe made this a little bit more difficult for me is that it was hard to connect to the characters. I think that in these other books, especially like Hunger by Roxane Gay, there's that sense of vulnerability and that sense of drawing you in and connecting you that makes it manageable, that makes it feel like you really care about these characters and you're willing to go through the trauma with them. But in Freshwater, the characters feel very, very distant. The book is told almost exclusively through the viewpoint of the gods that live in the main character's head, not from her perspective, and they're often talking about that character and just sort of describing what happens to her, and it feels very, very distant. Even the gods, sometimes you get insight into their feelings, but again, they're very non-human feeling, and it's a little hard to empathize with them. So I struggled very hard with connecting to the story, to the characters. I felt I couldn't understand always the actions. I just struggled to feel that connection and to care, which meant that as it got darker and as more and more bad choices were made and more abuse happened, I didn't have that connection to kind of help me pull through that. So it really was difficult for me to finish this book. And that, again, it could just be a lot more to do with me and my ways of handling things. If you're somebody who can handle darker things and who doesn't sort of need to be babied, I think it might work a lot better for you, but I'm still new to reading anything that doesn't have a happy ending. So it was difficult for me. And for me, overall, I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars. And lastly, I finished The Terracotta Bride by Zen Cho. This is a novelette that is on my TBR for May for Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which I will link below. And it is set in sort of a Chinese-Malaysian afterlife in hell, in I think the 10th circle of hell, something like that. And it follows a girl who is dead, and she has been married after death to a powerful man who gets a new wife who is made out of terracotta. And this is a little different than I had thought. I had thought that the main character was the Terracotta Bride, but that's not the case. The main character is a human who has died, and the new wife is terracotta. This story is really interesting. I absolutely loved the mythology of the afterlife, in kind of following what happens, the burning of money or goods to send to the ancestors who are rich or poor, depending on how much their descendants look out for them and send them things. All of that was really interesting. There was a lot of bureaucracy in hell, which I found very curious, and all of that was really, really cool. The main character was interesting. It was very much a YA feeling story because the main character was a teenager who was just awakening to herself and her power and her beliefs, and that was interesting. But the story arc itself, I thought, was a little rushed. So while I enjoyed a lot of the themes that were explored in this, I thought this idea of, you know, what is the afterlife like? How does this relate to life? What is alive? What is dead? What is human? What is not? What is a relationship? What is not a relationship? There were a lot of interesting themes that were covered in this, but the storyline itself kind of started out a little slow and then gained so much speed that toward the end, it felt like we were just totally rushing through. So this was a novelette, something like 50 pages. I feel like if this had been more of a, even novella length, like double the size at 100 pages, it could have been explored a little bit better. I really liked the world. I liked the characters. I was so interested in learning more about them. So it felt kind of like it was rushed in the ending, and I would have liked to see a little bit more. Overall, I definitely enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm interested in picking up some other works by Zen Cho. Okay, so that wraps up week 18 for me. I hope that you're having a great reading week. If you've read any of the things that I read this week, please leave a comment and let me know what you thought.